feel. And maybe even putting your arms or your hands just gently in your lap. And if you're comfortable, you can close your eyes or maybe just slightly close them so that you're blocking out part of the outside world here. And I invite you now to take a few deep breaths, breathing in love and breathing out peace. Breathe in love, breathe out peace. And take a moment to connect to that inner heart space where that divine presence loves and moves and just has its life inside of us. The place that we can always go to connect. And I invite you to just take every bit of yourself, all of yourself, in with compassion today. I'm going to guide you in a brief meditation, and as I do, just try to hold that compassionate, loving space as you bring yourself into the fullness of that divine presence. Beautiful flaws. Many years ago in ancient China, an old woman walked down to the village well. This was her regular routine. She had walked this road twice a day her entire life to fetch water. A couple of clay pots were dangling from her sides. One of the pots was perfectly formed, and the other was a little cracked. The cracked pot was always ashamed. Water was dripping from it constantly, and when the old woman arrived, it was always only half full. But she did not replace it. One day, as the woman was walking back from the well, the cracked pot could not bear the humiliation any longer. It was wet and messy and dripping all over the road. "Why do you keep using me for water?" it asked in frustration. "I am flawed and useless. Why don't you just replace me?" The old woman smiled at the cracked pot. She said to it softly, "Look down at the ground." The cracked pot obliged. It was surprised to discover beautiful flowers blooming only on its side of the road. They formed a lovely path all the way down to the well. Unknowingly, the pot had been watering them all these years. The woman picked a couple of these lovely flowers, and she took them to her simple home to decorate it. And so I invite you to think of that inner divine presence as that perfectly formed pot, and that human side as the pot that we often view as cracked or in some way less whole. And I want you to invite those beautiful flaws that you see in yourself to come sit with you for a while. What are those areas of your life that you struggle with, that you have trouble letting go of, have trouble offering a safe space to? And I want you to invite them just to sit with you for a moment, to have a cup of tea in your heart space. Open up your sense of compassion, of acceptance, of love, and ask one of those flaws that you see in yourself to just sit with you for a moment. Sit with it with compassion and love. Ask it questions about why it hurts. Why is it bothering you? What can you bring to the table to make it feel whole again? Just allow yourself to sit for a few moments, lovingly in its presence, knowing that your divine guidance is there to support you. As we take a few moments to enter the silence, enter the silence. I invite you here today to take a few more breaths, to sit in this space just a few moments longer, allowing that sense of love and compassion to resonate with every part of your being. Wholeness means no part left out. Wholeness means no part left out. Before you bring your sense of presence back to this space, I invite you to thank that inner part of you, all those parts of you, no matter how you feel about them. Just say thank you, thank you, thank you for showing up today. Thank you for sitting and having a cup of tea in my heart space today. Thank you for showing me a part of myself that is part of my humanness. And as you're ready, you can start to bring your sensory awareness back to your fingers and toes. Maybe wiggle them. Maybe stretch your muscles a little bit. Maybe roll your shoulders or roll your neck. And as you're ready, bring your sense of awareness back to this time and place. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Again, I wish to welcome you to Unity Spiritual Center of Panama City. My name is Melissa Arendt, and this morning we are continuing our exploration of Frank Ostaseski's book, The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living. Now, if you are joining us for the first time today, or if you are new to this Sunday series, I invite you to watch our previous 2 services on the first 2 invitations. The first one is Don't Wait, and the second one is Welcome Everything, Push Nothing Away. Today I'm going to be speaking about this 3rd invitation, Bring Your Whole Self to the Experience, but I also invite you to join us over the next 2 Sundays as we explore Find a Place of Rest in the Middle of Things and Cultivate Don't Know Mind. So I want to begin today's message with a story. This is a story that's recounted in many contemporary Buddhist traditions here in the West. I can't tell you how true this story is. There's a lot of stories that we know were written long after the Buddha's time. There's a lot of stories that are added to the scriptures over the years, the Buddhist scriptures, and so this seems to possibly be a late addition. Yet it really resonates with what I want to speak to you about today. It's a story about the Buddha and the figure of Mara. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Buddha, the historical Buddha is said to have achieved enlightenment. He was sought out many teachers, and he couldn't find what he was looking for. And finally, in his resolve, he decided to sit under the Bodhi tree. And it's recounted that he spent like 40 days sitting, something to that effect, like so many days sitting under the Bodhi tree. Some of the accounts vary on the time, on the number of days. But on the eve of his enlightenment, it's recounted that the Buddha spent his time in battle against the demon god Mara. And this demon god attacked the Buddha with everything that was in his arsenal: jealousy, lust, anger, greed, fear, doubt, all those things that we consider to be the negative sides of ourselves. Now, the Buddha was successful. He obtained enlightenment. He served as a loving witness to Mara's attacks. And he said, "You'll find no truth in that here." Having failed, Mara left in disarray in the morning of Buddha's enlightenment. Yet, according to the stories, it seems Mara was only temporarily discouraged. So even though the Buddha had achieved enlightenment, even though the Buddha had been seen as a revered teacher throughout India, Mara continued to make these unexpected visits to the Buddha. And when he did, the Buddha's loyal attendant, Ananda, would say, "Hey, I want to protect the Buddha. I have to let him know that Mara's here." And Ananda would attempt to try to hide, like almost sometimes the presence or sometimes like, "Hey, we need to send him away. Let's get rid of him." But instead of ignoring Mara, what the Buddha would do is he would calmly acknowledge his presence and say, "I see you, Mara." He would then invite Mara to sit with him for a cup of tea. And he would serve Mara as an honored guest. He would offer Mara a cushion so that Mara could sit comfortably. And then the Buddha would go about making a cup of tea for both of them, and he would sit it down lovingly. And then he would sit with Mara, and he would compassionately and lovingly listen to what Mara had to say. And he would treat Mara's attempts at persuasion, attacks, with loving kindness. And Mara, finding no way to persuade the Buddha, would then leave and go about his day. And we're told that the Buddha remained free and undisturbed. And so I bring up this part of the story, or this story in part, I guess, to call your attention to this idea of bringing the whole self, all of us, that part that we call Mara, that part that we call Buddha, to your whole experience. Now, in this section of the book, which I have to tell you, if you haven't gotten this is one of the best reads I've ever had spiritually. This is one of the best Buddhist reads I've ever had. This is going on my shelf for the long term. This is going to be referenced quite often for me. Frank Ostaseski really asks us, he invites us to live in a compassionate place that deals with life and death. And in doing so, he's asking us to bring all parts of ourselves to the experience, all parts of our humanness to the experience of living and to the experience of dying. So on the surface, what does it mean to bring your whole self to the experience? To me, what I've gotten out of the last couple weeks of reading this, it means bringing all parts of me to the experience, no matter if I view these parts as good or bad, light or dark, helpful or unhelpful, or somewhere in between. There's a lot of shades of gray, people. No matter my judgment on these parts of myself, my journey is calling me to embrace all parts of my human experience with compassion and love. Now, Frank Ostaseski says, and this is a quote that Reverend Ron read earlier, to be whole, we need to include, accept, and connect all parts of ourselves. We need acceptance of our conflicting qualities and the seeming incongruity of our inner and outer worlds. He goes on to say, wholeness does not mean perfection. It means no part left out. I want you to take a moment to think about that. No part left out. So on a deeper level, what does it mean to bring your whole self to the experience? It means that you're not leaving out those parts you disagree with, those parts you don't like, those parts that you want to improve upon, that you want to change. You can still want to change those, yet lovingly hold space for them. It means showing up in the full beauty of the human experience, everything our humanness has to offer, love and loss, joy and sorrow, acceptance and disapproval, patience and anger, contentment and worry, self-worth and the fear of rejection. It means lovingly and compassionately embracing all parts of yourself, of your experience, even those parts of yourself that are grieving, even those parts that may be declining in health, even those parts of yourself that you resent. That's a tough pill to swallow, isn't it? It doesn't mean rejecting the parts you don't like, and it doesn't mean shaming yourself to the point of injuring your self-worth or your sense of wholeness. Yet I don't know about you, I find myself doing this over and over and over again, right? It's what we do time and time again. We push away those parts we don't like. We reject them. Maybe we hide them under the parts that we do like. Or maybe we just try to ignore them, pretend that they don't exist. And in doing so, we become our own worst critics. Now, Frank Ostaseski has a chapter specifically on taming your inner critic. And I want to relay some of this to you because I feel like it's one of the most important parts, I think, of this entire section that I'm talking about. So what happens when we become our own worst critics? We have an inner dialogue. We engage in an inner dialogue that attempts to degrade and attempts to pass judgment under this phony guise of what we can call self-protection or even motivation. And we can call this judgmental inner voice our inner critic. Now, some believe it can be a motivating factor, but usually psychologists and spiritual teachers alike agree and understand that our inner critic can cause us a great deal of distress. It can cause us a great deal of discomfort. It can actually be non-motivational. It can be the opposite of creating motivation, and it can create needless suffering. As Frank Ostaseski explains, you can't please your inner critic. He goes on to say, let's face it, in the critic's eyes, nothing you do is good enough. If you show up, well, you should have showed up better. If you don't show up, you should have showed up. Now, we all have this inner critic. If you don't believe me, sit with yourself for a day and listen. Now, this is an inner voice that passes judgment on our past actions. It shames us into performing a certain way, and it criticizes us when it believes that we've done something wrong. Now, we can identify this voice in part by just the sense that it's a judgment, it's a tone that makes us feel as if we are unworthy. It's the should haves, the could haves, the you're not good enoughs. Now, most of us would not accept this kind of dialogue from a friend. I certainly hope that if I were to ever come to you in need of support, you would not treat me the way that your inner critic treats you. And I hope that you know if you come to me, I will not treat you the way my inner critic treats me. But if we think about the way we allow it to talk to us, is it any surprise that there are parts of ourselves that we're like, oh, I don't like that part. Can't have that. Got to hide that. Nobody can see that. Right? Is it any surprise that we have these parts? Now, he goes on to define our inner critic as the enforcer, one that demands compliance to an acquired set of standards or moral codes. Now, it's interesting because these standards and moral codes are passed down from us, from the culture we live in, our environment, from the judgments we pick up from others throughout our life. Our parents, our grandparents, our teachers, our partners, our co-workers, our peers, our spouses, our friends, everybody that we're around. We pick up on it. We pick up on the judgment. But I find it interesting that Frank Ostaseski, he does not advocate banishing or eliminating the inner critic entirely. He doesn't say get rid of it. Rather, he advocates transforming that inner critical voice into a more discerning voice, into a kinder voice. A voice that gently reminds us of our faults, gently reminds us when we haven't shown up as our best, but that also amplifies our strengths, that also provides us with courage to show up in all of who we are in our wholeness. Now, I'm going to tell you that this concept of the inner critic is not exactly brand new to me. I've heard the term before. I think we all have, in terms of you're your own worst critic, right? But I've never really done a deep dive into this concept before now, outside of maybe, I don't know, psychology class when I was in college. So I'm learning more about it. I'm becoming more aware of it. And I'm learning what I can do to tame it, or rather transform it into a better friend. So I've decided to give my inner critic a name so as to help identify it when it appears, and you might want to try the same. I've decided to call my inner critic Gruffy. Now, for those who don't know about the history of Disney, maybe you remember your kids watching their favorite show called Adventures of the Gummy Bears. Now, Gruffy Bear was one of the more critical characters on that program, but he was still part of the family. He still served a purpose. He still had a space, and he was still treated with love and compassion. So, I can't speak to your inner critic, but Gruffy, my inner critic, has several repetitive critiques he likes to throw my way to bring me down and to guide my behavior into something that he finds respectable. One of these judgments is laziness. If I'm not being productive, if I'm not doing something, if I'm sitting around reading, if I'm taking a break from doing a lot of stuff, if I'm tired and I need a nap, Gruffy reminds me I'm being lazy. Another judgment is that I'm somehow maybe selfish or unlovable, that if I'm taking care of myself and I'm not working and focusing on other people, that I don't care about them, and therefore I'm not deserving of their love if I don't spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, tending to other people. Now, both of these judgments are false. Yet both are parts of me that I have internalized, and they deserve space, they deserve compassion, they deserve love, they deserve understanding because they're part of me, so that I can truly embrace my wholeness, all that I am, the whole humanness of this experience. And my hope is that by embracing my wholeness with compassion, I can begin to maybe transform my inner critic into a more friendly, more truthful voice. Now, I like to think of this transformation process as one that is akin to something that, like, Franciscan priest Richard Rohr refers to as a fair witness, or the Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield refers to as a loving witness. So you can think about, how can I make my inner critic a loving witness rather than a harsh judge? So we could think of a fair or a loving witness as that inner voice that still acknowledges when you haven't shown up as your highest and best. It's not going to lie. But at the same time, it does so like a good friend, with kindness, compassion, love, respect. A fair and loving witness is one that's going to value truth-telling. It's going to value a balanced and kind of discerned approach, a discerned perspective that considers not just your humanness, but also spiritual principle, spiritual truth. So how am I learning in these first baby steps how to tame or transform my inner critic? First, I'm opening myself up just to the awareness that it exists. I'm giving it a name, and I'm listening to it. I'm inviting Gruffy to have a cup of tea with me. Now, Frank Ostaseski tells us that taming the inner critic involves a three-pronged approach. It's too much to get into in the scope here, but I want to say that these include our innate attributes of wisdom, strength, and love. And if you recognize some of those, you'll also note that they show up as our 12 powers. Now, all three of these are important, but for the sake of time, I just want to briefly focus on this last one, love. He tells us that love is that innate quality that can set us free. Love is that quality that opens the door to acceptance. Love is the quality that allows us to invite our inner Gruffies to share in a cup of tea. Now, in this section, he really talks about deep compassion. Compassion for yourself, compassion for others. And to build that compassion, he seems to kind of lay things out in the order in which he's presenting it, in which you got to do the inner work before you can have compassion in the outer work. So, in this process, you might call this practice self-compassion. You might call this transforming your inner critic to a more fair witness or a more loving witness, or you might even call it inviting Gruffy to tea. So I leave you with this prayer on love. Love resides throughout the entire universe. I recognize the love within, and I utilize this power and presence for my highest good and the good of others. Love supplies me now and always. Through this divine love, through this power, I see through error thinking and embrace my ability to love myself and others. I embrace my ability to forgive myself and others. In love, we are whole and free from the illusions of separation. Love is our true nature, now and always. Namaste.
Oh, Melissa, thank you for such a wonderful message and a beautiful meditation, too. I loved it. Let's give her another thank you. And thank you, Ron, for platform this morning. And I want to thank our Unity singers, Tim, Rosalita, Brian, Dottie. Thank you so much this morning. And myself. Okay. We'll end our service this morning with our peace song, and so we'll gather in a large circle. I think we got plenty of people here to do that. Might be able to go out here, yeah. Maybe. Let's see. Well, let's see. Maybe we have to go in here. I don't know. Can we stretch? There we did it. Let there be peace on earth and let it begin with me. Let there be peace on